With his purple crayon, anything was possible.
Gotcha. Wax. Pure imagination.
So, Harold and the Purple Crayon is a 2024 movie based on the 1955 book of the same name, and it's fine. The book is pretty good. The movie was okay, I guess. The kids in the theater seem to enjoy it, and that's great. But I don't think it'll be one of those children movies that stands the test of time or stays fresh in kids' minds in the years to come. By the time this video comes out, the movie probably won't even be a hot topic anymore. But, it's based on a children's book, and that's sort of in my wheelhouse, right? So yeah, the movie's got some problems, and I don't want this to just be a comparison between the book and the movie, though there will be some of that. More than that, I want to understand the movie's failings, especially in the context of what makes the book quite good. It's actually hard to compare the movie and the book because, as it turns out, the movie is a quasi-sequel to the book. I'll explain shortly, and while I'll touch on various weak spots in the film, what I mainly want to focus on is messaging. How do you deliver a message in a story? Because as it stands, the Harold and the Purple Crayon movie undermines its stated message completely. So let's start with a very brief summary because I'm pretty confident that only like 4 of you watching this video actually saw the movie. First, to briefly summarize the book, young Harold finds himself in a void and decides he wants to go for a walk in the moonlight, so he draws a moon and something to walk on and gets going. Along the way, he draws some pie, a moose, a porcupine, and several other features. Eventually, he decides he wants to just go home to his bed, ultimately drawing his bedroom and going to sleep. As for the movie, an aged-up Harold portrayed by Zachary Levi realizes that the narrator, the old man, no longer speaks. Finding himself directionless, he draws himself into the real world, bringing along Moose and Porcupine, who each become human. They're portrayed by Lil Ray Howery and Tanya Reynolds, respectively. Harold runs into Zooey Deschanel's character, Terry, and her son, Mel, played by Benjamin Batani. Terry takes kindness on Harold after he helps her change her tire, in an accident he caused, by the way. We learn Terry used to play piano before her husband died. From there, antics ensue. Harold uses the crayon to paint Terry's house, make pies, and build a plane. With the plane, he uses skywriting, encouraging the old man to call Mel's mom, whose number they also write in the sky. Meanwhile, a librarian and aspiring author, Gary, played by Jermaine Clement, sees Harold using the purple crayon and realizes he's the character from the book. Gary hopes to take the crayon for himself and bring his literary world to life. Harold goes to touch base with Terry, wondering if the old man called. She's at her job at some Walmart-type store. Mel gets in an accidental skirmish at school, so Terry has to go pick him up. She asks Harold to cover for her, and he creates accidental chaos when trying to help people at the store with his purple crayon. Terry comes back only to be fired, but bounces back pretty quickly since she realizes she always hated her job. Later that night, Harold draws a piano, and Terry plays it to the applause of many pedestrians. Gary soon shows up with the book and explains Harold's existence to him. As such, Harold realizes that the old man is the book's author, Crockett Johnson. But before anything more can happen, Harold and friends get arrested. But then they escape jail almost immediately, so... Anyway, Harold, his friends, and Mel go to Crockett Johnson's former house, finding it's a museum after Johnson's death. After discovering Johnson's passing, Harold becomes depressed and everything he drew begins disappearing, including his friends. In his depressive state, Gary finds him and convinces him to hand over the crayon. Since Gary is a writer, he tells Harold that he can be the narrator. But once the crayon is in Gary's hands, he vows to take revenge on the publishers who rejected him. Luckily, Harold broke the crayon in half earlier, giving one half to Mel. The boy shows up and gives the half crayon to Harold, letting him square off against Gary. Harold's drawings reappear, including his friends, who help him defeat Gary, stripping him of the crayon. From there, Harold draws a door to Gary's fantasy world. Gary enters, and they burn the door behind him. From there, Harold and co. revisit the Crockett Johnson Museum, finding a letter wherein Johnson explains why he made Harold, but I genuinely forgot what the reason was. I'm pretty sure it was to bring joy to other people, but I seriously can't remember. Anyway, after that, Harold and his friends return to their world. Okay, I suppose in the interest of fairness, I will share some things I liked about the movie. I honestly thought a few of the jokes were pretty decent. I feel like when you put Jermaine Clement in front of a camera, you're bound to get at least something that's usable. I also appreciated the acknowledgement that working a regular 9-to-5 is a soul-crushing experience, but we'll talk more about that a little later. Overall, it's just like, kind of a cute movie, you know? I don't mean that in a condescending way, I mean it genuinely. Also, the crayon effect looked pretty decent when characters would draw in the air with it, but that was perhaps the only consistent special effect. I think the best compliment and the worst insult I can give this movie is that my life is exactly the same after watching it. It was not so egregiously bad that I'll be thinking about it for years to come, but it was also not so great that it changed my mode of thinking in any way. Let me try and explain why it fails to make an impact. The movie has quite a few pacing issues, both on a macro level and on a beat-by-beat level. I had to wonder how much of this movie was left on the cutting room floor. There were so many jarring cuts and abrupt scene endings that it felt like every scene was initially meant to be longer, but they had to get the movie down to 90 minutes. Like, for example, there's a scene where Gary has to pay for his parking, but he parked too far away from the toll machine, so he has to lean comically far out of his window to pay. On paper, it sounds like a more funny, quiet moment between some craziness, but it happens so quickly that the audience can barely take it in and it loses its comedic punch. These pacing issues aren't helped by multiple plot threads that just don't seem to amount to anything. Like, there are these two detective characters. We very briefly see them talk to someone who witnessed Harold's antics. The young detective writes his statement down and the older detective writes him off as crazy. Then the scene just ends. They literally each had one line. They're meant to be recurring characters. That scene is meant to be their introduction, and we barely learn anything about them. To me, it was pretty clear what kind of dynamic they were supposed to have. The young detective was supposed to be trusting, and she would see things for how they were. Meanwhile, the older detective would be skeptical the whole time, not taking his young partner seriously. And even though we don't completely get this dynamic in the film, you're still sort of primed to expect a scene where the older detective sees the crayon in action and is proven wrong for assuming witnesses were crazy. But that never happens. After the detectives catch Harold and his friends and put them in jail, we never see them again. Also, after being put in jail, Harold breaks out immediately, so it really leaves the viewer wondering what the point of all that was. Like, what function did the detective character serve at all? Similar to these issues of pacing and unfulfilled or unsatisfying plot threads, we have several issues of character development. Mel has almost no character development to speak of. There's this subplot where he's being routinely bullied because he believes he has an imaginary dragon as a pet. However, he doesn't really change as a character in order to defeat his bullies. He just draws his dragon into existence. We never see him question who he is as a character. We never see him grapple with his belief in his dragon or his belief in Harold. Terry as a character is even worse because she's so inconsistent. Sometimes she's stern and uncompassionate, other times she's a little too compassionate. She really flips on a dime and for no reason. Like when Harold gets her fired from her job, she's initially very upset. She made it clear multiple times that she really needed the job and tried to convince her boss over and over again that she loved working at the fake Walmart. But after being mad for 1 minute, she just kind of says, I always wanted to trash this place anyway, and just seems to immediately forget the consequences of being fired. This next bit feels even more egregious to me. Remember in the plot summary how I mentioned that Terry was a pianist? Then Harold draws a piano and she plays it. So this happens the very same day that Terry was fired. On its own, that's technically fine, but after Harold creates the piano and asks Terry to play, she says that she hasn't really played at all since her husband died. In my mind, there's no reason for her to start playing again, right? Especially because as a character, she has every reason not to. She doesn't play the piano because of her unprocessed grief, and she takes no action to process her grief, so she should still have no reason to play. Not to mention, Harold just draws the piano right there in public, and Terry paints herself as a rather reserved character, so a public setting really doesn't seem like the place to just jump back in. Speaking of grief, there's also Harold himself. We understand pretty early on in the story that Harold has no concept of death. It isn't until he meets Mel, who explains his father passed away, that he learns that a person can die. And even then, he doesn't seem to really get the idea, but later he seems to understand it pretty clearly when he finds out that Crockett Johnson is dead. More denial from Harold would have made sense in that moment, forcing him to come to terms with what death actually means. But okay, sure, let's say he can fully understand death in this moment. At least his reaction makes sense. Sort of. Before this moment, Harold never really grappled with the fact that he was a fictional character. And granted, Harold's not portrayed as the brightest of characters, but then why should it matter later when Crockett is dead? Here's what I'm getting at. If you received definitive proof that you didn't exist, that you were a fictional character, you would probably have an existential crisis, right? You'd probably experience that no matter who your creator was or whether they were alive or not. Sure, the state of your creator might affect your existential crisis in some ways, but you'd have one either way, right? It's only after Harold learns that Johnson is dead that he starts to grapple with his existence, and that just doesn't make much sense to me. Harold realizes that he's fictional, and if his creator is dead, what does that matter? He even realizes that his friends, Moose and Porcupine, are fictional on a different level from him. They are creations of a creation. These ideas are actually pretty complex and interesting, but they don't feel earned because they're not really discussed or explored very thoroughly. Maybe you think I expect too much from Harold and the Purple Crayon. It's just a kid's movie after all, right? Well, it still could have been a kid's movie while presenting something interesting and compelling for all ages. Let me try and explain. Harold and the Purple Crayon is an example of the refugee from TV Land trope. It's sort of exactly what it sounds like. You have a character from TV Land who suddenly finds themselves in the real world. Of course, it's not exclusive to TV. The refugee can come from any given fictional universe. For example, in the Goosebumps movie from 2015, the characters exist in a real world where the Goosebumps books are real, published novels. However, the first editions of each book have the power to unleash the monsters from within the stories. Or, for an even more recent example, consider 2023's Barbie. The film sees its title character heading to the real world along with Ken. Barbie is an interesting case because Barbie has an effect on the real world and the real world has an effect on her. The woman who owns her doll counterpart starts having depressive episodes, which causes Barbie to ruminate on life, death, purpose, and existence. It's these depressing thoughts that prompt her to take a journey to the real world. Once in the real world, Barbie sees her effects there. She realizes that as a person and as a symbol, she's only propagated woman's suffering, or so she's led to believe. But she also experiences the beauty of life, complete with its joys and sorrows, leaving her conflicted. She has to grapple with the question of what it means to be a woman, and, to a greater extent, what it means to exist in the real world. Meanwhile, Ken is grappling with the question of what it means to be a man. When Barbie later meets her creator, Ruth Handler, she asks for permission to become human. This makes sense because for the duration of the movie, Barbie has been grappling with questions of humanity, questions of death, sadness, joy, womanhood, and manhood. And in response to her asking for permission, Ruth simply tells her that she doesn't need permission. What a powerful existentialist message. None of us need permission to exist. No one needs permission to be human, or to be a man, or to be a woman, or to be neither. We simply are, regardless of what anyone else says. And even though Barbie has some problems on a macro level in terms of its plastic feminism, from a narrative standpoint, it's all very coherent and even powerful. Let's compare Barbie's journey to Harold's. Both Barbie and Harold start out with some level of naivety. Neither has any idea how the real world works. In fact, Barbie has several misconceptions about the real world and finds herself extremely disappointed that she hasn't affected the world in the way she hoped she would. And that's really the key difference between the characters. Barbie understands, at least on some level, her relationship with humanity. Harold doesn't seem to understand anything. That's not really a great jumping off point for a character. Before I go on, let me point something out about characters. Most good characters have something that they want, but also something that they need. Like Disney's Hercules, what he wants is to be among the gods. What he needs is to understand his place on Earth. Barbie is actually kind of similar to Hercules. What she wants is to simply exist among her fellow Barbies, sharing their thoughts and way of being. But what she needs is to understand why she's having difficult thoughts. Or we might say that Barbie wants to help her owner but needs to accept herself in order to do so. With Harold, well, it's kind of hard to say. We can tell what he wants. He wants to find the old man, the one who narrates his story. But it's hard to see how that translates into a need until much later in the story. In comparing Harold's journey to Barbie's, the doll confronts questions of existence because she gets to confront her effect on the world. Harold doesn't have that opportunity because, and I don't mean to be rude, he hasn't had much of an effect on the world. Don't get me wrong, there are many people out there who love this book, but Harold just isn't comparable in any way to characters like Barbie or Mario, for example. Which kind of begs the question, why is this a movie? Does Harold just prove that Hollywood will try to turn any IP into a cash grab? If the writers wanted Harold and the Purple Crayon to be a story about existence, that should have been clear much earlier in the film. And frankly, I'm not even sure it is a story about existence. Yeah, that is apparently the arc that Harold goes through, but he really doesn't go through it till the end of the movie. As I said, the need doesn't become clear until late into the story. This, to me, sort of indicates that the writers weren't really sure what they were adapting. I read this quote a long time ago in my video about the Muppet Christmas Carol, but I think it's worth repeating here. As John Ellis wrote for Oxford's academic journal Screen, the adaptation trades upon the memory of the novel, a memory that can derive from actual reading, or, as is more likely with a classic of literature, a generally circulated cultural memory. The adaptation consumes this memory, aiming to efface it with the presence of its own images. Barbie isn't a novel, of course, but still, when adapting the character of Barbie over to the big screen, it's not just about the story of Barbie, it's about the cultural memory that Barbie circulated over her lifetime, a memory about feminism and girl power. As Verity Ritchie, aka Verily Bitchy, said, "It would have been impossible to make a movie about Barbie without diving into the cultural discourse around Barbie." Or, as they put it when paraphrasing Margot Robbie, the conversation around Barbie's controversies is going to happen either way, so better to be involved in that conversation. But again, Harold doesn't really have a cultural memory attached to him. There isn't exactly a cultural conversation around Harold, so adapting the book just doesn't make that much sense. Still, let's say you were determined to adapt Harold. You'd have to know what the book was all about, right? So what is it about? Well, admittedly, it's hard to say. Like many good children's books, it's rather ambiguous. The movie emphasizes the importance of imagination and creativity, and honestly, it's hard to argue with that interpretation. Harold and the Purple Crayon, the book, does seem to say something about creativity. However, the movie also asserts that the Purple Crayon is all about helping others, but I'm really not sure where the writers pulled that one from. I suppose he kind of helps Moose and Porcupine by feeding them pies, but it was sort of the other way around. He didn't want the pies to go to waste, so he creates a couple of creatures to eat them up. One of the movie's problems is that it's just trying to do too much. Barbie is a movie about feminism, and ultimately, that will intersect with ideas of existentialism. Asking what it means to be a woman or a man or neither crosses over into what it means to exist in the first place. Or, as Simone de Beauvoir explained in her book, The Second Sex, man historically defined what it meant to be human. As such, woman was not seen as human, woman was simply seen as other, not man, not human. Meanwhile, Harold and the Purple Crayon doesn't seem to know what it's asking. I'm left asking, is it a movie about creativity? Is it a movie about helping others? About striving for one's passions? About existentialism? It seems to want to be about all of these things at once. No wonder there are so many hanging threads in this movie, it's all over the place. And what sucks is the existentialist message really could have worked. There could have been something interesting with Mel, since he's constantly put down for believing in something that's not real, his pet dragon. He's made to feel less than by his peers and even his mother at one point. So is he less than for believing in Harold, since Harold is a fictional character? Is Harold less than for believing in himself? Unsurprisingly, these questions remain unexplored. Instead, by the end of the movie, as Harold confronts Gary, he says he believes in himself. But he says that for no reason. Nothing changed between his all is lost moment and his confrontation with the villain. Mel didn't even give him an empowering speech, even though he completely had the opportunity to do so. Harold just starts believing in himself because the plot demands it. And this is where the movie perhaps undermines its message the most, in its treatment of the villain. See, any good villain will pose a physical threat to the hero. That doesn't necessarily mean they have to literally fight, but villains will set up physical barriers to keep the heroes from achieving what they want and need. Like in a rom-com, the villain might be an ex-boyfriend who interferes with our protagonist's attempts at finding love. But a truly great villain will pose an ideological threat to the hero as well. Thus, it's not just a matter of physical barriers, but mental barriers. For example, the ex-boyfriend might leave, but before he does, he might poison the mind of our protagonist too thoroughly, perhaps making them believe they're unworthy of love. In Spider-Man 2002, Peter knows that with great power comes great responsibility. He knows that he ought to use his gifts to help others. The Green Goblin, on the other hand, opts to use his powers for personal gain, for revenge. He knows that he's been endowed with greatness, but that just makes him think he should be propped up by everyone else. Harold actually has a bit of a similar dichotomy. Harold wants to use the crayon for selfless purposes, while Gary wants the crayon only for his own gain. He wants to take revenge on every publisher who ever passed him up. The film portrays Gary as a struggling, failing author and a bit of an incel. He has a fantasy book series that he has yet to publish, and it seems will never be published. There's one scene where Gary is doing a live reading at the library with only 3 people seated to hear him. 2 of the listeners, a mother and son, get up and leave when the writing verges on erotic, and the other listener is just asleep. So more than anything, Gary just wants to be a published author. He wants to be famous and well regarded. He says his books should be bigger than the likes of Harry Potter. Think back to our discussion of wants and needs. Gary wants to be published. He wants to be famous. So if that's his want, what would his need be? If you think like I do, you would probably expect the story to point him in the direction of creativity. Harold and friends would help Gary realize that he shouldn't write for notoriety. He should write because that's what he enjoys doing, right? That seems like the logical conclusion to his arc. Not only does that seem logical, but it would theoretically parallel the other arcs in the film, or at least the arcs that were supposed to be there. It doesn't matter if people take Mel seriously, he takes joy in the pet dragon he's created. It doesn't matter if Harold is fictional, he still believes in himself. Following that line of thinking, Gary should come to realize that he should believe in himself and feel joy in that belief. Instead, Harold just creates a door to Gary's fantasy world, and they send him off, burning the door behind him. And this isn't even a happy ending for Gary because he meets the woman of his dreams, and she just openly rejects him, so it's not really his fantasy world at all. And as I mentioned earlier, Gary is portrayed as a bit of an incel. The woman of his dreams, a character in his story, is heavily based on Zooey Deschanel's character, whom he obsesses over. Don't get me wrong, this is weird behavior and it should be corrected, but the way the narrative treats Gary seems to communicate that he's simply irredeemable because of this obsessive behavior and because he's a bad writer. In fact, the narrative seems to try really hard to make Gary irredeemable in the end. He goes from being a little weird to wanting to kill Mel so that he can be with his mom. And as a viewer, I'm just left wondering, where did that come from? Yeah, attempting to kill a kid would make him irredeemable, but it just comes out of nowhere. It's another decision that feels like the plot simply demanded it. He's otherwise just kind of an odd guy. Gary is where the movie truly undermines its message. Remember how I mentioned that Harold touches on how soul-crushing everyday employment is, and how instead people should follow their dreams? Like Terry should be playing piano instead of working at off-brand Walmart. Seems like a cute message, right? Well, heaven forbid you're bad at what you do. If you suck at the thing you're passionate about, like Gary does, you better just stick to the life that you hate. Moreover, the plea to follow one's dreams instead of working a 9-to-5 sounds great on paper, but how well is that going to work out in the real world? This is a problem I have with a lot of children's movies. They tell kids that you simply can't be happy with your circumstances as they are. I feel like the movie Soul struck the perfect balance when it came out. I remember watching Wisecrack's video about Soul after its release and reading this comment underneath the video. This interpretation of the movie has stuck with me 3 years later. As the commenter explains, the message isn't about accepting your mediocre job, it's about being more than your job. It's about individual fulfillment and redefining it in terms of the things in life that are actually important. When Joe goes back to the world, he doesn't plan on merely accepting his job, he plans on living every second of his life to the fullest. The purpose is to remind ourselves as humans that our natural need to focus and plan our futures out can prevent us from truly finding our own subjective individual fulfillment. We can still live our lives as they are, while living them to the fullest. It's not about simply accepting our circumstances, it's about becoming more than our circumstances. But Harold doesn't see it that way. Unless you're following your dreams, you're not doing it right. But if you're bad at what you love to do, you're also not doing it right. Funnily enough, there was another comment under that Wisecrack video that also feels applicable here. Take something you love and turn it into a job is the best way to turn what you love into something you hate. So the narrative rewards Terry for leaving her 9-to-5. Also, the narrative very irresponsibly never punishes Mel for skipping school and lollygagging with Harold, and that just bothers me. Again, the message just feels so jumbled. Should people be responsible or shouldn't they? I don't know anymore. There's another theoretical draft of this movie where, instead of being made a total joke, Gary is taken seriously by Harold. He teaches him a lesson about the joy of creation and self-fulfillment. After all, Harold learned that he didn't need an author to matter, right? Why does Gary need anything beyond himself to matter? It would have been an excellent moment to connect and put a nice little bow on everything the characters learned. Instead, Gary doesn't really learn anything. As it stands, this movie just feels like an earlier draft of a much better story. When I write first drafts, I know that everything is unorganized and unfocused, even though I'd like it all to be perfect. I get so caught up in the story that I don't necessarily think about how the message carries. And that's fine, that's exactly what editing is for. But that just makes me wonder how many revisions this script must have gone through. To me, it seems like the message of this movie was so jumbled because the writers couldn't truly decide what the overarching message even was. And keep in mind, stories can have more than one message, obviously, but there should probably be just one main overarching message, one for which the hero fights and the villain fights against. Other messages can branch off from there, but if the central message isn't firmly planted, the secondary messages will feel muddled just as well. Again, perhaps you think I expect too much from this film, but I disagree. If we can create an entertaining and thought-provoking movie based on Barbie of all characters, then we really can do the same for Harold. But hey, at least the book is still good, right? And it's good to remember that. Crockett Johnson was a genuinely talented man. As mediocre as the movie is, Johnson's reputation will remain unaffected. Not only was he a great cartoonist, but he was a great artist in general. Look at these fascinating geometric paintings he did, many of which hang in the National Museum of American History. How amazing to know that the man who wrote Harold into existence is forever part of American history. Talk about a man being more than the sum of his parts. I probably sounded pretty harsh on this movie towards the end, but I genuinely did think it was cute. If the kids liked it, more power to them. In fact, my favorite part of this movie was the chaos that erupted in Not Walmart. Not because of the scene itself, but because someone at the front of the theater was just absolutely losing their mind over the scene. They were just laughing hysterically, and honestly, that just made my enjoyment of the movie so much greater overall. Well, this video has sort of been a weird little rant. Hopefully you at least learned something from it. Did you see the movie? If so, what did you think of it? Have you ever read the book? What was your interpretation? What did you think of this video essay? Please tell me everything. As always, I want to take this opportunity to thank my patrons. I thank them endlessly for their support. If you want to support what I do, consider joining the channel's Patreon. You can join the community Discord and get early access to videos. We just started doing some mini writers workshops and it's been a lot of fun. As a patron, you can also receive priority review over on the second channel. Subscribe over there if you want for some writing tips. To support the channel in other important ways, feel free to do all the stuff that the algorithm likes. You can also follow me on Instagram to see what I'm reading and Twitter to see some rough drafts of my poetry. Thanks for watching, and keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft. Also, legendary character actor Alfred Molina is in this movie as the old man, and geez, talk about underutilizing your talent.